Okay, just another minute or two and we'll get started. Okay, it is 2 o'clock, so let us get started. Welcome to Office Hours. I am Jeff Slutsky. In case you do not know who I am the Chief Flight Instructor at the Princeton Flying School. I am broadcasting from you on the second floor of the Princeton Flying School in the offices of Elite Flight Experience. And this is basically just a forum for you to have any questions you may want answered about aviation. If not, I use this to kind of go over some of the topics that are in the ACS for the private pilot for now or other levels if anyone's here looking for that. There is a chat function on your Google Meet which you can use to send messages. So please, if you have any questions, to use the chat to send a message. And we can do that at this time, answer your questions. Otherwise, I will just present on a couple of topics that I have presented, I've thought may be interesting, and we'll move from there. So just before we get started, if you have any questions, let me know. Armando says he can't see me, but I see that the camera is on. I don't think anyone else is having that problem, Armando, so I'm not sure what that's about. Okay, first off, I just want to mention that there's been a special federal aviation regulation promulgated by the FAA last night. It's an SFAR. If you look in the FARs, there's a special section called SFARs. There's sort of things that don't fall into the normal sections, and they're issued for special reasons. For example, there's an SFAR in the FARs for Robinson helicopters that you need specific training to fly a Robinson helicopter. There's also a SFAR for the Mitsubishi aircraft because it had a lot of crashes. So before you could fly a Mitsubishi aircraft, there's special rules about that. So anyway, the FAA has issued an SFAR due to the coronavirus, COVID-19, and that SFAR gives relief to some of the requirements that the FAA has for our normal recurrency rules. So I read the regulation last night. It's fairly long. I don't recall exactly how long, but I think it's somewhere along the line of 100 pages or so. So it's a very complicated regulation. They give reasons why they're doing things, who does it apply to, stuff like that. And I didn't read it very carefully, but there's definitely, well, I read it sort of carefully. I didn't read it in depth, let's say. There are a couple of things that will definitely apply to you all. So I will just mention that here to start. The first is that the written test that normally is good for 2 years, if you have a written test that is expiring in the next, well, I guess through June 30th, then there's a 90-day extension of that written test validity. So for example, if your written test was going to expire on May 31st, that now is good till August 31st, currently with the SFAR. So you would not have to take the written test over again. I know at least one of my students who had a problem with their written test was expiring and they can't get their check ride done right now. One of the things that has not been done is the 3-hour requirement for your check ride within the previous 2 calendar months has not been waived. Actually, the FAA specifically mentions how important it is that, given what's going on, that people fly with the flight instructors before their check rides. So that has not been waived. There's no waiver of any rules for going solo, going cross-country, or anything like that. That all still applies. There is, if anyone out there is already rated pilot, there is regulations about extending the time if your flight review comes due in this period up till June 30th as well. And they've given a 90-day extension. But in my reading of the regulation is that is only for commercial pilots or above, or for people doing COVID-related activities. So, for example, if you are flying medical supplies for hospitals, then you would be allowed to do that. You would, without having your flight review if it's going to expire now. But I do not think that it applies to everyday pilots. In addition, if there's any instrument pilots with us today, the recurrency rules for instrument flying have also been extended by 90 days. It wasn't entirely clear to me, but I also think that's also only good for commercial pilots right now, in the same kind of rules. Also, you need to have done like half the currency. You need to have done at least 3 of the approaches in the previous 6 months, to get that extension. If you haven't done any approaches, that wouldn't apply. And then there's a bunch of other smaller things that wouldn't apply to most of you out there. There's some relief for CFIs, some relief for mechanics who are undergoing their training and stuff like that. But most of that wouldn't apply to you guys and gals, I believe. So that is the SFAR. There may be further changes coming, but I kind of doubted it right now because that's what we were waiting for, was that SFAR. For some reason, I have trouble saying that. SFAR, standing for Special FAR. That is what I wanted to mention there. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk today about airworthiness and certification that your aircraft is good to go. So in the ACS, the Advanced Certification Standards for the private pilot, there is a section on Task 1, letter B, which is airworthiness requirements. I'm going to briefly just show you that in case you've never seen it before. Present now, window. Doesn't seem to want to let me do that. Okay, so it doesn't want to let me do what I want to do. It has to be on this browser, and it's not. So we're not going to do that now. Okay, anyway, if you have the Advanced Certification Standards, there is Task B, which is airworthiness requirements. And it says the objective is to determine that the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with airworthiness requirements, including airplane certificates. The first item is general airworthiness requirements and compliance for airplanes, including certificate location and expiration dates. So let's start off with that relatively easy item to begin with. So all of you should be doing your ARROW check on every flight when you go flying. And in case you've forgotten that from your very first lesson, the first letter in ARROW stands for Airworthiness Certificate. The airworthiness certificate should be in a little plastic pouch or window, depending on which plane you're flying, in the pilot's side. And that airworthiness certificate is issued by the manufacturer of the aircraft when the aircraft is manufactured. So on the date of manufacture, the manufacturer is saying that this aircraft is airworthy, was built to the standards that we've gotten approved by the FAA, and is ready to go flying. And that airworthiness certificate is good for the life of the aircraft as long as the airplane is maintained in an airworthy manner, which we'll get to later. But basically, there's one certificate issued one time, and that same certificate that was issued when the aircraft is manufactured should still be in the aircraft. If you happen to lose the airworthiness certificate, the FAA just in the past year has set up a new system where you could actually apply for an airworthiness certificate online and get a new one. So it's not a big deal. It used to be you used to have to go to the FSDO, the Flight Standards District Office, which in our case would be in Allentown, and we'd have to go there and we have to apply for a new one. But that don't have to do that anymore. Now we could just apply for it online. So that's the airworthiness certificate. The next R among the documents you need is the registration. The registration is for a particular owner of the aircraft. So the registration should be in the same place as the airworthiness certificate in our aircraft. The registration is good for generally 3 years. It's kind of like your car registration. You have to get a new registration every once in a while. The FAA sends out a little postcard notifying you that your registration is about to expire. You go online, you pay the big old fee of $5, and you get a new registration. It's one of the most cheapest things you could pretty much do in aviation is renew your registration certificate. The registration is good for as long as you own the aircraft. If you sell the aircraft, then a new registration has to be put in the aircraft. After the sale of an aircraft, you'll also often see a temporary registration in the aircraft. That is actually like the bill of sale, and that is good for, I believe, 120 days until by that point you should get the new registration. If perchance you did not get a new registration from the FAA because they're backed up, because they're shut down for coronavirus, for example, you could just put a new bill of sale in there and you get another 120 days. So it's a very simple system. You just have to have something in there saying who owns the aircraft. Once you've transferred it, there has to be that new registration from the new owner. You can't use the old owner's registration anymore. That is the first R in Arrow. The second R in Arrow is the radio station license. The radio station license says that there will be a radio operating inside the aircraft. Currently, you only need a radio station license if you're going to leave the US. We no longer require a radio station license if you're flying a US registered aircraft within the United States. But if you want to take one of our planes to Canada or Bahamas or Mexico, for example, or all destinations people have gone to, then you have to have a radio station license on board. The only aircraft in our fleet right now that has a radio, actually there's two actually. The two aircraft that have radio station licenses are 2 Papa Juliet, the DA-40, and also 4 Alpha Bravo, the DA-42. None of the other aircraft have radio station licenses. They also don't have customs stickers, which you would need as well to go internationally, but that's not one of the documents we're going to talk about. The next, the operating manual could be one of a number of different things. For a modern aircraft manufactured after, I believe, 1978, you're going to have inside the aircraft the POH, which is specific for that particular aircraft. So if you go ahead and look at 2 Papa Juliet or 38 November and look at the POH in the back of the aircraft behind the pilot seat or the co-pilot seat, and you open up to the first page, there will be a serial number on there and a model number as well. So that POH is specific to that particular aircraft. You cannot take the POH from let's say 0 Papa Sierra and switch it out with 2 Papa Juliet. That wouldn't be allowable. Even though the same model aircraft, they're different serial numbers. Same thing with 8 Mike Charlie and 3 Romeo Mike. You couldn't switch the POHs, they're specific to the aircraft. Now, some older aircraft didn't have POHs specific to the aircraft. They had generic POHs. I think 9 Whiskey Romeo is one of those types of aircraft that doesn't have one that's specific because it's such an old aircraft. And that is basically what the POH is going to be. In very, very old aircraft, in fact, I flew one of those like in 1969 aircraft, you don't even have a POH. You have just called what's the operating limitations. So the little placards inside the airplane or the stickers, that is actually the POH in that case, because there was no official POH. I see a question has come in. Is the registration the same thing as the N number? Okay, so the registration is for a particular N number, but it's not the N number itself. An N number is issued when the aircraft is manufactured. You could actually select your N number if you buy your own aircraft, which is kind of a cool thing. So if your initials are JS, you could put something starting Juliet Sierra, and you could search the FAA's website and the database and find out any open numbers that are available. So that's one thing that you could do, is get your own registration. In addition, anytime you have an aircraft, not registration, N number, anytime while you own the aircraft, you could get a new N number. So let's say I wanted to change to Papa Juliet from 412 Papa Juliet to 412 Juliet Sierra. If that number wasn't currently used, I could just go in, apply, I think it's, which is the fee, $10, I believe, $10 fee. I could get that new N number, and I could change the N number. Along with getting a new N number, then you would get a new registration. So the registration is specific to the airplane, but the N number can change for a particular airplane. And some of our aircraft, you'll actually see the N number has changed. I think to Papa Juliet may be one of those. If you look at the first page, you'll have a different N number than it has right now in it, in the front of the POH. So in that case, it's kind of like it's different than, say, your VIN in your car. Your VIN is never going to change, but the registration changes. Here, you could change the N number, and you could change who owns the car. So that's the way it works with N numbers and registrations. So that's the answer to your question, I hope. Okay, so that is the O in arrow. And the last item is W. W stands for weight and balance information. Okay, now, a lot of students think that means that you have to do a weight and balance and have it inside the aircraft. Now, I'm not disagreeing that you shouldn't or don't need to do a weight and balance. In fact, you have to check the weight and balance before every flight. But the certificate or the document requirement is not that you do a weight and balance, but that the weight and balance information specific to the aircraft is inside the aircraft. In general, in almost all aircraft, except for the P model 172s, you're going to see the weight and balance information is going to be a couple of pages or a single page, most usually, in the POH, in the weight and balance section, which is section 6. So if you go to section 6 and you look through, there'll usually be a page that's put in the binder by the mechanics that has the updated weight and balance information. It's going to tell you what the basic empty weight of the aircraft is, what the arm of the aircraft is empty, and what the moment of the aircraft is empty. Any time that you change equipment in the aircraft and there's a change in weight or location of weights, then you have to update and put a new weight and balance in. When it's a small change, the mechanic just does a recalculation. So let's say we take out an old transponder and we put a new ADS-B transponder in that weighs 2 pounds extra. In that case, they could just do a paperwork change where they just go ahead and they recalculate what the new weight and balance information is, and they'll put that in the POH, and then you would use that for your weight and balance calculations. And that new information is what has to be in the POH. If there's a major change, then you actually have to reweigh the aircraft and rebalance it, which is actually something that only a few maintenance shops can do. So let's say you put a new type of engine in. Instead of having an engine with a normally aspirated engine, you put a turbocharged engine in. That's going to make a major change to the weight and balance of the aircraft, and then you're going to have to go ahead and you're going to have to do a new weight and balance, and that's going to be in the POH. So that is the weight and balance information. As part of the weight and balance information, there should also be an updated equipment list in the POH. The equipment list in the POH should be updated for all the changes to the equipment since the aircraft is new. So if you look at 9 Whiskey Romeo, there's probably been a ton of changes in the equipment list over time, and hopefully we have an updated one somewhere in there that says what the new equipment is. That is a fairly common thing not to be updated correctly by a lot of mechanics, and something that has to be reviewed when you, for example, buy an aircraft. Okay, so that is the basic documents that you need to do when you are flying. Next item here is required inspections and airplane logbook documentations. Okay, so we have another acronym for us to use in aviation to help us with the required documents, required inspections for aircraft. And the acronym is AVIATED. And I'm just going to type that in so you all have it written down somewhere. AVIATED. Okay, there you are. AVIATED. That is our inspection acronym. The A stands for annual inspection. Every aircraft, and that's all inclusive, every aircraft has to be inspected once a year, well, every 12 calendar months. So if the aircraft was last inspected on April 3rd, 2019, then that aircraft inspection is good until April 30th, 2020. So if we have any aircraft in the fleet right now that was inspected last April, they have to be done by today. Tomorrow, the inspection would no longer be good and the aircraft would no longer be airworthy to fly. So that is the annual inspection. The annual inspection has to be done by a specific type of mechanic. The type of mechanic that does an annual inspection is called an IA. IA stands for Inspection Authorization. So at our flight school, at our maintenance shop, we have Jeff Vamos, who is our IA. He's not the only one, but he's our head one. And he's the person who has to do annual inspections or another IA. That's the annual inspection. The annual inspection, there's certain things that have to be done in an annual inspection, and that is going to be listed in the maintenance manual for each individual aircraft model. So 172S has a inspection manual for how to do maintenance on it. The DA40 has an inspection procedure found in the maintenance manual. The DA42 has its own inspection procedure. So that's by the manufacturer and tells you what to do. So that's the annual inspection. The V in aviated stands for VOR check. The VOR check is a required inspection for IFR flight only. And so if you're a private pilot without an instrument rating, you do not have to do a VOR inspection. VOR inspection has to be done every 30 days, and it has to be recorded somewhere. So normally we just have like a little piece of paper on the clipboard where we keep track of it in the aircraft that fly IFR. If you fly 2 Papa Juliet or 4 Alpha Bravo, you can look, and normally there's a list of the last times, the ones that are VOR inspection, in case you wanted to fly IFR. That's the V, but again, that's not for VFR flight. The I in aviated actually is supposed to be the number 1, and that stands for 100-hour inspection. So a 100-hour inspection is in addition to the annual inspection, and is only necessary if the aircraft is used for hire. I think we mentioned this a week or 2 ago, but what does for hire mean? From the FAA's point of view, a for-hire operation is when the same organization provides the aircraft and the pilot. So when you're in the flight school and you're flying with SOD, for example, and you're flying in one of our aircraft, we are providing SOD and we are providing the aircraft. So that aircraft is for hire. If, though, you're taking out 2 Papa Juliet and we're not giving you an instructor that day, you're just going and you're renting it or you're soloing, whatever, then that aircraft is not for hire. It's being rented, but rented is not the same as for hire. So in that case, where you're just renting 2 Papa Juliet, you wouldn't have to have a current 100-hour inspection. A 100-hour inspection, practically, in our case, is pretty much the same as an annual inspection. You're going into the aircraft manufacturer's maintenance manual, and what do they say for 100-hour? Well, most small general aviation aircraft, the 100-hour and the annual are virtually the same. So we're pretty much doing the same thing at 100-hour that we're doing at an annual inspection. The big difference about a 100-hour inspection from an annual inspection is that the 100-hour inspection does not have to be done by an IA. In this case, it can be done by a normal mechanic, which is called an A&P. which is airframing propeller. So a regular mechanic who still has to be certified and still be trained and stuff like that, he just hasn't gone up to the level in IA, which has more experience requirements and more testing that he has to go through to become an IA. So that's the 100-hour inspection. So in our case of our flight school aircraft, mostly we're doing 100-hour inspections because most of our aircraft are used for hire. Now, a 100-hour inspection cannot replace an annual inspection. So if you have an aircraft that was going under annual April of last year, and then we did a 100-hour inspection this month, we still need to do the annual inspection. The 100-hour cannot replace the annual, again, because the 100-hour is done by a different mechanic. Now, an annual inspection, though, can replace a 100-hour inspection because it's done by the higher level mechanic. So if you've done an annual inspection and you just done a 100-hour 20 hours ago, you still get a new 100 hours. You don't have to do another 100-hour inspection in 80 hours, for example. So that's the way that works, that you don't have to worry about that. So that's 100 hours versus annual inspections. Okay, so that's the I in aviated. The next letter in aviated is altimeter inspection. So the inspection of the pitot static system to make sure that your altimeter is working properly is an inspection, again, that is only required for IFR flight. So in that case, they go through a special test. They make sure that the altimeter is within 75 feet and the pitot static system is working properly. If you're flying the aircraft VFR, you do not need that inspection. So if you look at the logbooks for a 9 Whiskey Romeo, for example, the 172P model, we don't have pitot static system tests in there because it never goes IFR because it's not IFR equipped. So that is the pitot static system test, which again is done every 24 calendar months in this case, and only for IFR. The T in aviated is for the transponder. The transponder test is another test that's every 24 calendar months. The transponder test is only necessary for aircraft that are either going IFR, above 10,000 feet, or flying in airspace where a transponder is required. So if you're just normally flying in uncontrolled airspace, or even Class Echo airspace, if you're below 10,000 feet, you would not need a transponder inspection. You do not need a transponder inspection, in addition, in Class Delta airspace for the most part. So if you're just flying into a towered airport, you do not need a transponder inspection. Where you do need a transponder inspection is in Class Charlie airspace, in Class Bravo airspace, Class Alpha airspace, under the lateral limits of Class Bravo airspace, and in the Mode C veil of Class Bravo airspace. So if you really just say Mode C veil of Class Bravo, basically that's all the other Bravos that I said before. Class Charlie, you only need it if you're in the Class Charlie. But Bravo, you need it if you're in anywhere in the Mode C veil, even if you're not in the actual Bravo airspace. So if we're taking off from Princeton Airport, we're in Class Gulf, so that wouldn't normally need a transponder, but we are in the Mode C veil of New York. So in that case, all of our aircraft have to have current transponder inspections. So if you look at 9 Whiskey Romeo, which has never seen 10,000 feet and has never been flown IFR, it still has a transponder inspection because it does fly out of the Mode C veil every single day. That is the transponder inspection. Next, every 24 calendar months. E is the ELT inspection. The ELT inspection has to be done annually, so every 12 calendar months. Now, there's a difference between the ELT inspection and the battery replacement time. A lot of people get these two confused. There's just a straight requirement that you have to inspect the ELT every 12 calendar months. There's a completely different requirement that's not an inspection requirement, but just a requirement that's in the FARs about ELTs, which says that an ELT battery has to be replaced when it's expired, when it's halfway through its useful life, or if it's been used more than 1 hour cumulative use, or if it's been used because of activation due to an accident. So any of those 4 reasons, then the battery has to be replaced. That is a separate requirement from just an annual inspection of the ELT unit itself. When you do the ELT unit inspection, you will also check to make sure that the expiration of the battery is current and does not have to be replaced. The last letter in our aviated acronym is the D. And in this case, that stands for Airworthiness Directives. Airworthiness directives are the aviation equivalent of recall notices. So, you know, if you ever own a car, every once in a while you get a recall notice from like Ford or Toyota, and they'll say your airbag has been recalled because it may inadvertently activate while you're driving, and that'd be a bad thing. So come to the dealer and we'll replace it, no charge. Or if you may get, you know, something's wrong with the crankshaft or whatever in cars. So we have the equivalent of aviation. If after manufacturing, they find out that there's something that's a significant problem, then they'll issue an airworthiness directive. Unlike in cars, though, airworthiness directives are issued by the FAA, not by the manufacturer. So the FAA has to make a determination that the financial burden is not too high and the safety concern is large enough to actually issue an airworthiness directive. The fact is that manufacturers would like to issue ADs every day because they hate liability and they want to make lots of changes to aircraft. So for example, if I was a manufacturer, I could issue an AD, if it was allowable in this case, which is not obviously, which said, hey, you have to replace the engine every month. This way we know you have a new engine. Or I could say, after 10 years, you have to replace the airframe, something like that. But the FAA would look at that and say, no, that's not really a safety issue. That's causing a lot of problems. You can't issue that AD. I'll give you a quick example because this is kind of interesting the way the world works. What's happened with this. Cessna made a change, and I can't remember the exact change, unfortunately, but I remember the situation. And in all aircraft, in their new aircraft, they made a change to the way that you had to do something in their aircraft. And then they wanted to go ahead and issue an AD saying, everyone has to go ahead and do this in their aircraft as well. I think it was something like a standby vacuum system or something like that. And they went to the FAA to issue an AD, and the FAA said, no, this is too costly and it's not going to save enough lives, so you can't issue an AD. So Cessna went back to Kansas with their tail between their legs and was upset about this. So what they did is went through the back door and they updated the POH to say that all aircraft have to have a standby vacuum system, otherwise they're not airworthy. And they put that in the POH. It's a revision to the POH. And every once in a while, POHs get revised. So if you look at your information manual, for example, you'll see what date it was last revised. And then a very famous mechanic sued Cessna and went to the FAA looking for relief. And they said, Cessna has essentially done an airworthiness directive without your approval. And I don't think this is right. And the FAA actually agreed for once with the rank and file aviation community and said, hey, that's true. You can't make something retroactive. All you could do is say you need this going forward. Otherwise, you would be doing basically airworthiness directives. So manufacturers can't force you to do things that the FAA doesn't think is necessary. That's an airworthiness directive. So that's the nice thing. So Ford could issue a recall notice. They don't have to ask the government. Now, the government may find something wrong and make Ford do that, but that's another story. But manufacturers of airplanes can only recall something with the FAA's approval. On the other hand, the bad part about the system is in basically almost every case that there's a recall notice in aviation, the onus for the financial burden is on the owner. So if Cessna go ahead and makes, let's say this month, because of COVID, they're making a bunch of airplanes and they have a bunch of like temporary employees because they don't have, you know, the normal people, and they all put the wings on wrong. And then the FAA realizes and issues an airworthiness directive say, hey, all people who bought an aircraft in April of 2020 have to get new wings. And then Cessna will issue an airworthiness directive. Hey, and who's going to have to spend $50,000 for new wings? The owners. Even though it's Cessna's fault in almost every case, it's the manufacturer's error, the owner still has the onus to pay for it. So that's airworthiness directives. Airworthiness directives come in different forms. Some airworthiness directives are one time. So they'll say, you have to do this once. In this case, let's say you have to replace your wings. More typical, they'll have a one-time inspection. They'll say, inspect your aircraft and see if we installed your wings incorrectly in this particular example. And then you can inspect it, and if it was installed correctly, then you wouldn't have to do anything going forward. Sometimes they'll have ongoing inspections. So a famous one for Cessnas, for example, is the C-track. So the C-tracks in Cessnas have a bad track record of moving in flight. So Cessna changed the way they made the seats on the new aircraft. But the older ones, like the P models, they have this little metal thing that stops the seat track from moving, and then has to be inspected on like every 100 hours by to make sure that that's still holding, because it's really bad if you go and you rotate on takeoff and then your seat goes backward and then you don't move your arms and then the plane pulls up into a vertical takeoff, and then you're going to stall and perhaps die, and someone's going to sue Cessna. So that's why there's a recurrent inspection. Sometimes they have things that have to be replaced on an emergency basis. So if they find out something is very serious, and they'll say this needs to be accomplished as soon as possible, and they'll say exactly what that means. They'll say within the next 5 hours. Sometimes they'll ground the fleet. For example, they grounded the Cirrus fleet recently of Vision jets because the angle of attack indicator was not working, was giving erroneous information. And this was shortly after the 737 MAX, kind of fiasco. So they wanted to make sure that, people don't get confusing angle of attack information. So they grounded the fleet, and then they went ahead and they had to make people replace their angle of attack indicators. In that particular case, Cirrus actually did pay for new ones because the aircraft were all in the warranty and they took it under their own financial responsibility. So sometimes that's nice. So that was an emergency grounding. More typically, what they'll do is they'll give you 5 hours or 10 hours to get the inspection done. A very famous one is in twin Cessnas. About, in the early 2000s, so 15 years ago or so, there were a couple of incidences where twin Cessnas, Cessna 310s, 340s, 421s, those kind of aircraft, especially the cabin class ones, the 421s, the 404s, the wings fell off in flight. You can imagine that wings falling off in flight of an aircraft is a relatively serious situation. So they issued an emergency AD for wing spar inspections of all twin Cessnas if they have a certain number of hours or more, and then every interval of 10,000 hours after that. So just to kind of give Cessna a break here, for you younger people, you may not realize this, but back in the old days, a lot of people used to use handwritten checks. You'd write a check out and give it to somebody. And those handwritten checks, when you would cash it, you wouldn't take a picture on your cell phone and just deposit in your account. You would bring it to the bank and you'd deposit it physically at the bank. And the bank would take all those checks and then they would deliver them to the airport. And then the airport would fly all the checks to the Federal Reserve location nearest to them where all those checks would be processed. It was a very labor-intensive process. And what was nice was that this was a very good business for people to fly charters, to fly planes from small communities to central locations where the checks would be amalgamated and whatever the Federal Reserve did with them. So they used to fly twin Cessnas for this. They were the famous plane to fly the checks to fly all the Federal Reserve. And so they basically were flying these planes every single day for years. And these planes, like our fleet, some of our planes have 3,000 hours, 4,000 hours, 5,000 hours. Some of these twin Cessnas had 30,000 hours, 40,000 hours, 50,000 hours. Cessna had never anticipated that an aircraft they built in 1965 would still be around 45, 50 years later and have 50,000 hours on the airframe. And there was repetitive stress on the wing spars over time, and then the wings fell off. So now there's this inspection that you have to do every 10,000 hours, which is a lot of hours. I mean, most aircraft never make it to 10,000 hours. But so every 10,000 hours, these aircraft have to be inspected to make sure the wings don't fall off, which is a pretty good thing. I mean, I flew a twin Cessna, I wouldn't have wanted the wings to fall off. There's very few things in aviation that you can't recover from. That's definitely one of them. So anyway, that's the different types of airworthiness directives there are. Now, I'm going to say something that hopefully doesn't confuse you, but I just want to make sure you understand it, so in case you hear about it. There is also something called a service bulletin, SB. Service bulletins are issued by the manufacturer. Service bulletins are not issued by the FAA. In addition, service bulletins are optional. They are not mandatory for the kind of flying we do. So Cessna can issue a service bulletin that says, we want you to paint every old airplane and make it look like new. It's up to you whether or not you want to actually do that or not. The only place where service bulletins are mandatory is if you're flying Part 135 or Part 121, charters or airlines. In that case, excuse me, sorry about that. In that case, the service bulletins are mandatory because that's a for-hire operation where you're carrying the general public on for charter operations, and you're held to a higher standard. But for the rest of us, the service bulletins are optional. Every once in a while, you will see something that says mandatory service bulletin. A mandatory service bulletin is only mandatory if an AD is issued along with it. So usually mandatory service bulletins are usually issued alongside ADs, or they mean that an AD is going to be issued soon. That's most of the situation. There are exceptions to that, but that's it. So that is all the inspections that you need to have in an aircraft for the aircraft to be airworthy. But there's one more. So the last part of the process. So when an aircraft is manufactured, it's airworthy. The day it leaves the factory, the manufacturer is no longer saying it's airworthy. Now we have the mechanics come along, and every year they say it's airworthy, or every 100 hours they say it's airworthy. But between those intervals, between the 100-hour inspections, if you have that, or between the annual inspections, if you have them, no one's saying that it's airworthy, are they? Well, in fact, they are. There is somebody who checks every time to make sure a plane is airworthy before they go flying. And that person is you, the pilot, or the student pilot. That's what a pre-flight inspection is. We can rename a pre-flight inspection and call it an airworthiness inspection. By regulation, it's in the FARs, it says that you must perform a pre-flight inspection to ensure the aircraft is airworthy before every flight. So that means if you see, let's say, Saad go out to the airplane, hop in it, and go flying without doing a pre-flight, he's violated an FAR, and that's why you won't see him do that. Every time I go flying, I hop in the plane, I do a pre-flight inspection because I have to legally check to make sure the aircraft is airworthy at that time. Even if I have my own aircraft, I keep it hangared all the time in one of the beautiful Princeton Airport hangars, and no one's touched it since my last flight 4 hours ago. I still have to make sure that it's airworthy before I go into that plane. I have to make sure that all the fuel didn't leak out. I have to make sure a bird didn't start living there, which is a big problem this time of year. I know that for a fact because my Jeep at home, which I haven't driven in whatever number of weeks we've been quarantined, has become a huge nest full of the birds in the neighborhood. So anyway, so same thing with airplanes. We have to check and make sure that, and who knows what's happened in the 4 hours since I flew to the aircraft. So you always have to do an airworthiness inspection, a pre-flight inspection. You are ascertaining that the plane is airworthy to go flying. You're the last line of defense. If you hop on an airplane that is not airworthy, you're violating an FAR. If there's an accident and they determine that you should have noticed that in your pre-flight inspection, you're responsible for not performing a proper pre-flight and determining whether or not is airworthy or not. Okay, that is the inspections required. The last part of this process is how do you find out that these inspections have been accomplished? And that is the aircraft logbooks. So every airplane has a logbook for the maintenance of the aircraft, just like you have a logbook for your flight experience. Anytime maintenance has been done on an aircraft, it has to be recorded in the logbook. Go ahead and change a light bulb, has to be recorded. Put a new door seal, has to be recorded. Do a 100-hour inspection, has to be recorded. So it all has to be in the logbook. There's generally 2 logbooks for each airplane. One is for the airframe and avionics, and the other is for the engine and the propeller. In the older days, there used to be a requirement for a 3rd logbook for the propeller separately, but that's no longer a requirement. So you don't normally see propeller logbooks anymore. They're usually just incorporated into the engine logbook. Just as a kind of funny anecdote, we had a Seminole at the airport at one point, a twin engine aircraft that we're using for flight instruction, had almost 10,000 hours on a very old aircraft, and from 1979. And I went to look at the logbooks and I said to Ken, hey, Ken, the propeller logbook hasn't been filled out since 1987. And he's like, well, we don't need a propeller logbook. I'm like, yeah, but it's not been filled out. What should I do? He goes, give it to me. I gave him the propeller logbook. He took it, he dropped it in the trash. He says, now you don't need any entries in the propeller logbook, it's just in the engine logbook. I'm like, okay. And that's perfectly legal because you don't need a propeller logbook anymore, but you do need entries in the logbook saying that you've done the propeller maintenance as required. So all maintenance has to be inside the logbooks. Those logbooks have to be kept. The logbooks are almost never found inside the airplane. Why, you might ask? Because in the case of an incident or an accident, if the logbooks were to burn up, say, after an accident, then you would have no proof that it was properly maintained. Most logbooks are either kept at the maintenance shop, like the ones at Princeton, all the aircraft on the line here have their logbooks in the maintenance shop. Personal owners sometimes like to keep the logbooks at home in hopefully a fireproof safe or something like that. But most owners just leave it at the maintenance facility where they do most of the maintenance. And if you ever go in our shop, you'll see there's a bunch of logbooks that we have who have different various owners' logbooks that we keep there. So that's the aircraft logbooks. Someone asked whether or not they could get to see the maintenance logs when they come in for a lesson so that you could see what they look like. And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. In fact, one of the things that you do on a Prague 26 with me when you go for your mock check ride, if you're in the private pilot program, is you will have to show me that those inspections have been accomplished. And if you've never seen the logbook before because your instructor hasn't gone over with you, which they normally only do like the lesson before Prague 26, so it's not unusual not to have seen it at any point. But if you haven't seen it, then I'll go over with you at that time. In addition, on your check ride, you will have to show the examiner that your aircraft is airworthy. So you have to show that they have the required documents in the plane. You have to show that the inspections have been done and are current. So that's a requirement that you have to do. Those logbooks are taken with you on the check ride to show to the inspections. Now, I said to you, normally logbooks are not found in the aircraft. This is an exception when you go into your check ride where you bring it with you if you're leaving Princeton Airport for your check ride. Most of you do your check rides now at Princeton, so it's not a problem anymore. Definitely do not want to lose the logbooks to an aircraft. If you lose the logbooks, it's okay. Now you just put all the new inspections going forward in a new logbook. But if the aircraft has to be sold, you've just taken away a lot of the value of the aircraft, especially the newer the aircraft, the less value the aircraft will have without a logbook, because people want to see what maintenance has been done, what damage has been done to the airplane. If you don't have a logbook, no one knows what's been done to the plane. Maybe it's never been inspected. Maybe it had a huge crash that it was fixed by some guy sitting in I don't know, some small airport that the guy doesn't know what he's doing, something like that. So the logbooks are very valuable. You don't want to lose them. So yes, you could definitely take a look at that. Now, someone else asked, why is a service bulletin required when an AD is already out for a specific problem? And the answer is it's not required. Service bulletins are oftentimes issued before the AD is out because the process to issue an AD takes some amount of time, whereas the manufacturer can issue a service bulletin anyway, anytime they want. So if I'm at, Diamond in Austria, and I decide, hey, I want to issue a service bulletin today, I could go to my keyboard, issue a service bulletin, whatever the procedure is at the company, and now it's a service bulletin that took all 5 minutes to disseminate to, and if you own aircraft, you'll get emails all the time from the manufacturers not quite all the time, but on a regular basis saying, hey, you have to do this, you have to do that, or whatever. So you get, these days we get them through email, or in the old days they used to get postcards saying, hey, there's a new service requirement. So that could be done very quickly, but the AD comes out afterwards. Generally, I don't think they normally issue service bulletins after the AD, although maybe they do, I'm not really sure about that. But anyway, usually service bulletins come out before the AD. So that's the answer to that question. Okay, so that is the required inspections, and that is how they're put in the logbook. Okay, the next item on the ACS is little c, airworthiness directives and special airworthiness, which we've gone over. Next, purpose and procedure for obtaining a special flight permit. So we're going to go over that a little bit more in a second. But so basically, if your aircraft is not airworthy, you do not have a 100-hour inspection. If it's, wouldn't really apply for hire. You don't have an annual inspection, say. A lot of times, let's say Ken buys an aircraft that's been sitting at some grass field in Pennsylvania for 8 years, and he wants to bring it back to do a annual inspection, make sure everything's okay, or buy the airplane. How can he fly that airplane from that grass field back to Princeton if it's got no annual? It's not airworthy, right? So it's not legal for you to do that. So you could get what's called a special flight permit. We call it colloquially a ferry permit. It allows you to ferry an aircraft one time when it's not airworthy from the location where it is to the location where you're going to make it airworthy. You have to go directly to that location. You cannot, like, for example, fly from the strip in Pennsylvania, stop over at Skymana for lunch, and then go over to Trenton and like pick up a passenger and then fly to Princeton. That's not kosher. You have to fly directly to the facility. You could stop and pick up fuel if you can't make it to the facility, but you have to go directly there. And it's a one-time thing. So if you go on May 15th, you can only go on May 15th. You can't do it again May 16th, fly back, and then fly again on May 17th. That's not kosher. So you just have to do that one time. So that's a fairly common thing when aircraft are no longer airworthy to be able to do that. Also, if there's equipment that's inoperative that makes the airplane airworthy, you could also get a special flight permit for that. So every once in a while, we have someone, let's say they had a problem and they made an emergency landing and the aircraft's not airworthy anymore. We send Ken out to go pick up that airplane wherever it is and fly it back to Princeton. Maybe it has a bad mag or something, and that maybe means it's not legal to fly, which we're going to discuss in a couple minutes. So Ken would fly it back after getting a special flight permit. Ken has actually flown back aircraft from all sorts of weird places, like short fields, grass fields, by bridges, like all sorts of locations to get aircraft back to Princeton to have maintenance done on it. So if you have some time, you could ask Ken for one of his war stories, or ask him to tell him about the days he used to do repos on the aircraft. That's also pretty funny as well, but we don't have time for that now. So that's a special flight permit. Okay, next item. Pilot performed preventative maintenance. So, are pilots allowed to do any maintenance on an aircraft? Well, I mentioned before, if you want to do an annual inspection, you have to be an IA. If you want to do a 100-hour inspection, you have to be an A&P. Can you go out and change the landing light if you're supposed to fly at night and the landing light's not working and it's required because landing lights are required for hire at night? Good question. The answer to the question in this specific instance is yes, you could actually change the landing light. Pilots are allowed to do what we call preventative maintenance. So you could do small items that aren't major repair jobs. Now, what is the definition of preventative maintenance? Well, for that, you're going to have to check this manual over here. In section 43, section 43 is about maintenance. Section 43, I know you can't see that. And in section 43, in Appendix A, it specifically says the items that you are allowed to do that are preventative maintenance. Appendix A has A, what's a major alteration? B, what's a major repair? And C, what's a preventative maintenance? And if you look at section C on Appendix A, they list, how many items? 31 items that are allowed to be done as preventive maintenance. You can only do an item if it is on this list. Okay, you cannot say, oh, that sounds like preventative maintenance to me. No, we have to look at Part 43, Appendix A, little c, and find out whether or not what you asked is preventive maintenance. So, for example, one of our Tony Home, whoever that is, I think his home is his place, not his last name. But anyway, he asked, can a pilot do his own oil changes? And the answer to that question is yes, because oil changes are listed in Appendix A, little c, preventive maintenance, so you could do oil changes. So it's kind of a lot of the things are things you would think about. You could like tighten nuts, bolts, and fasteners. You could do oil changes. You could replace lights, but you cannot replace a strobe light because a strobe light has a power supply to it, and that's a separate situation that you can't do. So you can't do electrical work. One of the funny ones I usually ask on, this is going to give you my question for Prod 26. I always ask people, can you change the wheel bearings in the aircraft? And almost everyone says, no, that's not preventive maintenance. I'm like, how do you know? And they're like, well, it doesn't sound like it. Well, if you look in little c of the Appendix A of Part 43, it says you can change the wheel bearings. Why? I don't know. They determined that's considered preventative maintenance. So whatever's there is okay. If it's not there, cannot assume that you could do it. That's owner maintenance. Now, if you do maintenance, do you have to put it in the aircraft logbook? Yes, you do. Okay. Any maintenance done on an aircraft has to be logged in the aircraft. Now, do some owners neglect to put minor items in their logbooks? Sure. Who's going to know? Nobody really, but if you get caught to it, then it's not really legal. It is supposed to be done. Okay, so that is that. Now, some people ask me, can't I do annual inspection on my airplane myself under the supervision of an IAA, for example? And the answer to that question is yes. The requirement for annuals 100 hours is under the supervision of. So sometimes we have A&Ps in training. So we have one of our flight coordinators now who is actually working, helping out in the shop, and he's under the supervision of an IA. So he's kind of in training right now, learning how to be, I don't know if he wants to be, but anyway, he's learning to be a mechanic. So that's the way that works in that particular situation. It is allowable to do those things. So if it's not preventative maintenance, it has to be done under the auspices of a mechanic who reviews the work and makes sure that it's done properly. So you can't just do it yourself and he says, yeah, you must have done it okay. He has to actually inspect it and make sure it's done properly. So that is that situation. So that is preventative maintenance. Okay. It is 2:56. So we're going to do one task, one more thing that is going to take a little bit amount of time, but this is probably one of the most misunderstood things in aviation, and it's inoperative equipment. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly because I don't want to spend a lot of time. I know after these calls get to be more than an hour, people start to kind of drift off and, kind of lose their focus. So I don't want to spend too much time, but this is a fairly important item, and it's something that every private pilot should understand. What can you do about equipment not working when you go flying? Does everything in the aircraft have to be flying? Be there working when you go flying? Now, before we go there, I just want to say one thing, is that everything that's in an aircraft that's on the equipment list has to be on board the aircraft when you go flying, or it has to have been noted in the log that it's been removed. And if it's been removed, the weight and balance and the equipment list have to be updated. Now, that sounds really picayune, like who really cares about that or not? But for example, let's say you're flying 3 Romeo Mike, and 3 Romeo Mike, when it was certified, had an ADF receiver. And an ADF is an old-fashioned way of doing radio navigation. Or even worse, what if it had a 4-course, what the hell were those things called? Back in like the 50s, used to like listen to these beeping noises to figure out where you are. So you might have one of those things in the aircraft as well. If that was removed because nobody uses one of those anymore, it has to be noted in the logbook and the equipment list updated. Otherwise, the aircraft is not airworthy. Now, the reason why I know this is important, there's case law on this. This is a ridiculous case, but this is true. So, wow, that was a nice gust of wind. So an FAA inspector did what's called a ramp check. A ramp check is when they go to the ramp area and they come up to you and they say, I'm doing a ramp check, I'm checking out to make sure everything you do is legal. So they'll check your pilot certificate, your medical, they'll check to make sure that you have a photo ID, and then they don't have to actually go into the airplane, but they can look inside the airplane. You don't have to let them in. And this inspector looked in the airplane and he said, the cigarette lighter is missing from your aircraft. And the pilot's like, yeah, so I don't use it. No one's allowed to smoke in the plane. He's like, isn't it on the equipment list? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, I need you to bring me a copy of the aircraft logbooks to my office. And they bring them up, and there on the equipment list is cigarette lighter, a cigar lighter, whatever they call it in aircraft. And that made the plane unairworthy because it was flying without the required equipment on the equipment list. So make sure that if it's on the equipment list, it's in the aircraft. It can't have been accidentally misplaced. For example, to Papa Julie, if you go flying, one of the required items in there is the fuel level sampler, okay, which is found underneath the back seat in the little storage compartment. If that's missing, the plane's not airworthy. Have you ever used that? No. Has anyone ever used that in the Diamonds? No, but it has to be there. So those are things that we have to be careful about if we ever get ramp checked. Now, what about other equipment that's inoperative? Have you ever flown a Princeton Flying School aircraft that had inoperative equipment? Okay, none of you have your cameras on, but you should all be shaking your head up and down right now. You bet we have inoperative equipment in those planes. Every day we have aircraft that go out with inoperative equipment, some that always go out with inoperative equipment that we're never going to fix. How is that legal? Well, in 91-205, 91-213, 91-215, all those regulations talk about what's required in an aircraft and what to do when you have inoperative equipment. So first of all, you have to look first whether the equipment is required for flight. So 91-205 is the regulation that shows us required equipment. The first section is VFR flight, day, and then after that is night flight, and then IFR flight. And they list all the equipment that's required for those. So maybe your instructors taught you the acronym Tomato A Flames. It's a long acronym that lists all the different items that are required for day flight. And then when you do your night flight, he's going to go through flaps. That's the acronym for the equipment that's required to fly at night. And then if you become IFR, there'll be some more equipment that's called Grab Card is the next acronym for required equipment for IFR flight. And then you could combine things together, flight IFR at night or something like that. So anyway, those are all the required equipment. That equipment is required to be working, okay? So otherwise the aircraft's not airworthy. So if the required equipment is not working, it's not airworthy, the only way to fly it is if you have an airworthiness special flight permit for the to get you, as we talked about before, the ferry permit. Okay, so you should become familiar with 91-205 and make sure that the required equipment is working every flight. You're required to check that. So, for example, the turn coordinator is not in 91-205. It's not required equipment for a VFR flight, so you could fly without the turn coordinator. The airspeed indicator is required equipment. So if you go and you start doing your takeoff and your airspeed's not working, probably your flight instructors would say, abort, abort. And you'll abort the takeoff and you'll go back and you'll find out what's wrong. Once it gets to be summer months, a lot of times that happens because, mud wasps like to go inside the pitot tubes and make nests in there, and then it blocks up our pitot tubes, which is one of the reasons why you have to look carefully in the pre-flight inspection. And if that's not working, you cannot go flying. So that's a required piece of equipment. That's the difference between required and not required. One of the pieces of required equipment is a working fuel gauge for every fuel tank. So if you have a fuel gauge that's completely inoperative on your aircraft, you cannot go flying. If it takes a little while to warm up, that's okay. If it's, kind of once in a while it does that, that's okay. But if it's completely inoperative, that's not airworthy, and that's not kosher. So that's that. Some people, you may hear someone on forums online, fuel gauge only needs to work when it shows 0. That's not true. One of the requirements of a fuel gauge is that when it shows 0, it has to be completely accurate. But it doesn't say that it's the only time it needs to be working, and the FAA has ruled many times that a fuel gauge does need to be working, among many things. So anything that's required in 91205 is required. Next, if it's not in 91205, does that mean we could go flying without it? No. The next place you have to check is the manufacturer's list of required equipment. It's what we call the KOEL, Kinds of Operations Equipment List. In all new aircraft, there is something called the KOEL. In 172s, because they're such an old model, even the newer ones, we have they just say, the equipment that's required for VFR, day, night, IFR flight. But there is an equipment list even in the 172 manual that shows whether or not equipment is required. Take a look at the equipment list in section 6. If there's a letter R after a part number, that means it's required. You cannot go flying without that part. So for example, in the 172 manual or the DA40 manual, the alternator is required. The engine is required. Why are alternator and engine not in 91205? Because some aircraft don't have engines, gliders. Some aircraft don't have alternators. A Piper Cub, for example, doesn't have an electrical system. So that's a very generic rule. For each individual aircraft, the manufacturer decides what is required. So for us, we need an engine working. We need an alternator working. We need a battery. We need a pilot seat, for example, things like that. So you should look through what's required. That's called the Kinds of Operation Equipment List. That is different from the MEL. That is a very, very common mistake that most people think. The MEL is not the manufacturer's list of what's necessary. An MEL is what's called a minimum equipment list. The minimum equipment list is issued by the operator of the aircraft. Who operates the 172s on our fleet? The Princeton Flying School. Who operates the DA40s on our fleet? The Princeton Flying School, and maybe me as well. So that's the MEL. The MEL is made by the operator of the aircraft and is approved by the FAA. So they make sure that it's a reasonable thing. Why would you do an MEL? An MEL is basically only found in commercial operations where you're flying charters or airlines. So they all are required to have MELs. So if we decided to put 2 Papa Juliet on a charter certificate, it would have an MEL. And then even though you were flying it in a non-charter operation, you would still be required to go by the MEL if there was one for the aircraft. None of the aircraft on the flight line at Princeton Flying School have MELs. We might one day. We used to have 135 stuff here, but we don't right now. So you would have to look at that MEL. If it's in the MEL required, then you'd have to go ahead and have that. That's the MEL. So 3 places to check. Remember this. FARs, Kinds of Operation Equipment List, MEL. If the equipment is in none of those places, for example, a turn coordinator, can we go flying without the turn coordinator working? Yes, but we're not quite there. There's 2 more requirements. The first is that the equipment either has to be removed from the aircraft and noted in the logbooks and blah, 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 like we talked about before. So if we take the turn coordinators out of the aircraft, they don't have to be working anymore. That's one method that we use. And we've done that for some equipment. For example, a lot of our planes used to have ADFs, and the only one that has one now is 3 Romeo Mike, I believe. Maybe, I don't know, maybe one of the aircraft. So a lot of those have been removed. So, and that's noted in the logbooks, and that's kosher. Otherwise, the second thing is it has to be placarded inoperative and deactivated. Okay, those are both requirements. Now, what does it mean to be placarded inoperative? Well, if you've ever flown one of the 172s and you've seen a little Post-it note that says inop, that's probably me putting on an inoperative sticker that's saying I'm placarding it inoperative. If you see a label that says this instrument doesn't work anymore, that's the flight coordinator is doing that for me to show that it's inoperative. That is kosher. And it also has to be deactivated. We don't want it working and giving you false indications. So for example, if the attitude indicator was working, you wouldn't want to be able to see it while it's moving. You want to have it deactivated. So one way we could deactivate things is we could pull circuit breakers, or we could just cover them up completely so you can't see them or whatever. So that's how we deactivate an instrument or something. Okay, so either removed or it has to be placarded and deactivated. The last step, okay, so those are 4 steps now. So FARs, MEL, KOEL, inactivated, placarded, removed, blah, blah, blah. The last step is a determination has to be made by a certificated pilot that the flight can be made, that particular flight, without the equipment. So let me give you an example. Let's say the attitude indicator is not working. That happens in our planes sometimes. Attitude indicator is not working. Can you go flying without the attitude indicator? Well, it's not in 91205. Unless it's an IVAR flight. It's not in the KOEL because it's not required by Cessna for a VFR flight, and we don't have an MEL. So we could placard it and activate, but we have to say, hey, can we go flying with this or not? So you have to say, look out the window, do some weather checking. Can I fly without an attitude indicator today? If it's a beautiful day, sky's clear, visibility is unlimited, do you need an attitude indicator? No, I can see the horizon. I could go flying that day. The next day I come back to the airport, visibility 4. Is that legal VFR? Yeah. Cloud ceiling, 1500, is that legal VFR? Yeah. Is that a safe day to fly without an attitude indicator? I would say absolutely not. On that particular day, an attitude indicator would be required. So it's up to the pilot to determine that. Has to be a certificated pilot who's rated for the aircraft, meaning not student pilots. Okay, so if you go out to the aircraft and there's an inoperative piece of equipment, can you determine whether you could go solo that day? No. Can you ask your flight instructor when he comes out there if you could fly dual that day? Yeah. But if you're going solo, come inside and ask somebody, hey, can I fly without this equipment today? Can you ask Steve Nierenberg at the front desk? Is Steve Nierenberg a certificated pilot? No, he's not. He can't tell you. What if you walk up to Ken? If you go up to Ken and say, hey, can I fly without an attitude indicator? You know what Ken's going to say to you? Fuck yeah, you can fly without an attitude indicator. Just look out the goddamn window, right? That's what Ken's going to say. And is that okay? Yes, because Ken is a rated and certificated pilot, and he can make that determination on your behalf. So that's how you fly with inoperative equipment. So next time you go out and you have inoperative equipment, quiz your flight instructor. Check if it's allowed to fly with that. Make sure you know. And if you're going solo, make sure you check with someone inside and maybe go up and ask Ken and see if he gives those exact words that I used. If you go out there and, the pilot seat is missing, hey, can I fly without a pilot seat? Might get an interesting answer. So that is flying with inoperative equipment. It's fairly complicated, so you can see it took me about 15 minutes to go through it. Most pilots don't understand that, okay? You can't just fly willy-nilly with stuff broken. And even though you see that we have a lot of stuff sometimes placarded and inoperative, we've gone through the process to make sure that's okay. Okay, so I see we've lost a few of you over time here. Obviously, I said we ran over, and that's fine. If you have any questions, you could ask them now. I see there's two questions from earlier, which I will answer now. If you don't want to wait around for those answers, feel free to log out. And we will see you next week, same bat time, same bat channel. And we may have an announcement later, next week about some more of these sessions. Okay, so question number 1. When you have departed Class Delta airspace and you have not received a frequency change advisement by that Class Delta controller, can you switch frequencies without notifying that to our controller? Excellent question. Okay, so while you must maintain two-way radio communications when you're in Class Delta, once you've left the Delta, you do not have to have two-way radio communications anymore, so you can leave the frequency. So a good example is Lancaster. If you do a cross-country to Lancaster never, ever, ever, well, maybe never is too long, a harder word, but pretty much I really don't see them give you frequency changes. They just stop talking to you. So just as a courtesy, I usually like to call up and say, hey, Lancaster Tower, to Papa Juliet, I've left your airspace, have a great evening. It's usually on that night. And they're like, hey, thanks for that, have a good evening. But they don't care if I do that or not, because it's not required. If you leave Trenton, 95% of the time, Trenton's always going to give you a frequency change approved, because they prefer to keep you on the frequency as long as possible because they're a little bit more busy. So that is what's going on in Class Delta. So you don't have to stay with them once you're sure that you left their airspace. Make sure you leave the airspace before you actually switch frequencies, though, because that would be bad if you left while you were still in the frequency. But once you're out, you don't have to wait for them. Most Class Deltas do give you frequency changes, but not all of them do. Next question. If flying with flight following, are you allowed through Class Charlie or Class Delta without speaking to the tower controllers of those airspaces without being advised by flight following that you are cleared to do so? Does using flight following meet the CFR requirement of being in two-way communication with Class Charlie and Class Delta? This is a great question, okay? And I wish I could tell you that I could point you to a specific regulation that says the answer to this question. The regulations specifically say you have to maintain two-way radio communication. You have to establish radio communications, whatever it is, for Class Charlie and Class Delta. Now, if you're doing practice instrument approaches, okay, which is only an IFR thing, and some of you, and most of you probably aren't doing that, it is the controller's responsibility to clear you through the airspace. If you're on an IFR flight plan, you don't have to worry about it at all because you clear through any airspace. So if you're doing practice instrument approaches, the controller is required to do that. Still, it's a good idea, even when you're doing instrument approaches practice in your VFR, to check with the controller to make sure that they've coordinated for you. Now, when you're on flight following, it says in the controller's handbook that, and there's like some 9110 point something, which I don't remember exactly what it is, the controller is supposed to coordinate with airspace that you fly through, okay? The problem there, it says supposed to. It doesn't say that that it's a FAR requirement that relieves you of your responsibility to talk to Charlie and Delta controllers. This is a gray area. So what you would want to do is, if you're going to be flying through a Delta or a Charlie, is talk to the controller and ask them if you have permission to fly through the airspace. Don't count on the controller having done it for you on flight following, especially Deltas. If you're talking to Charlie, it's probably not going to be a problem because you're already talking to the controller who's in that airspace. Like if you're going to Allentown, if you're talking to Allentown approach, you're not going to have a problem flying through the Delta. You're talking to Allentown approach. But if you're talking to New York and you're flying through Morristown's tower airspace, I'd be worried about that, and I would check with the approach controller. New York approach, Diamond 2 Papa Juliet, am I cleared into Morristown's Delta? And he's like, yeah, cleared into Delta. He's like, yeah, okay, you're the Delta. If you're talking to McGuire, they'll oftentimes coordinate with you. If you're flying through Lakehurst, for example, hey, you can fly through the Delta at 2,000 feet or above. But you shouldn't just go flying through without checking that, because it's not entirely clear whether you're allowed to do that or not. And since it's not clear, better not to be careless and reckless, 9113, and better to make sure you do it. But the controllers should be helping you out there. But sometimes they get busy, and then what happens if they made a mistake? Okay, and that's the answer to that question. And let's see, any more questions here? We have one question from some guy named Vaibhav. Who is that guy? Never heard of him before. Anyway, just kidding, Vaibhav. We love you. For ELTs, how can a pilot know the battery level is sufficient for a flight? So there is no, you could look in the airplane what the ELT is. There's no way for you to specifically check the ELT. That's something that's going to be checked at the 100-hour of the annual inspection. The battery is going to be changed halfway through its useful life, or if it has an hour of cumulative use. So there should really never, ever be an issue where an ELT is not going to be sufficient. if it's being properly maintained. The only time where you may find a problem is if the ELT accidentally activated, but then if it's accidentally activated, then it still has to meet the 1 hour cumulative activation rule, blah, blah, blah. And if it was activated because of a real crash, then it has to be changed anyway. So there's really no way for you to know if it's the battery's still good or not, but if it's properly maintained, it's not a problem. But don't forget, you should be checking on 121.5 and listen to see if there's any ELT activation going on. If it's your aircraft, that'd be a pretty good sign that maybe you should go flying because the ELT is probably no longer good. So if we all check on 121.5, by the way, if you hear an ELT activation going off, it sounds something like this, and excuse my imitation, it's like, wah, 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 wah. Okay, I'm obviously not a good mimic, but that's kind of what it sounds like. If you hear that, it means there's an ELT going off somewhere nearby. It doesn't mean it's necessarily your plane. If you hear an ELT going off while you're flying and you don't have the emergency frequency tuned in, that means that your own ELT is going off and it's bleeding onto your radio frequency. So then you should definitely land. That happened to 2 Papa Juliet once, where the ELT just went bad and we had to replace it. So if you hear that siren going off in the background while you're in flight, land and we'll have that fixed. Okay, any last questions before we go? Okay, just one thing for those of you left, if you have a preference for times of day that you prefer, morning, afternoon, or evening, please email the fine front office staff, the flight coordinators at 39n@princetonflyingschool.com. We're just interested in your opinions about that. And we'll take your opinion into account just as much as the federal government takes our opinion into account. So just kidding. And that's it. Someone's asking where the previous video is posted. I have no idea. Please send a message to 39n@princetonairport.com, or maybe Vaibhav or Alex could pipe in right now if they're still listening. I have no idea. That's it. Thank you for joining us. Again, Jeff Slutsky, Chief Flight Instructor at Princeton Flying School, owner of Elite Flight Experience, and the person who will be doing your Prog 26 in the future. Have a good evening. It was nice talking to you.